Shri Amardeep Singh Bhatia, Additional Secretary, Department of Commerce, Government of India. President Jeffrey Rebello, Vice President Sridharan, Secretary General Sanjit, past presidents, international visitors, family and friends. It's such a pleasure to be here this morning with all of you. And I must start by saying that my exposure to the world covered by UPASI is somewhat limited. I come from, my roots are in a corner of southeast Karnataka, Kolar district, and this is what people call the Bayal-Seeme. This is the plains or the plateau. So the first time I ever visited a coffee estate was when I got married. My wife Sharmila is the niece of two former presidents, Mr. Lakshman Gowda and Mr. Balkrishna. And that's the first time I got an actual first-hand exposure to the world of coffee cultivation. And I certainly don't have enough exposure to the worlds of tea, rubber, spices, etc. But what that exposure did for me is it opened my eyes. Until then, growing up, my impression of coffee planters was a bunch of fun-loving people who came down to Bangalore and partied hard. I know that they continue to do that because I was with them last night. And I'm impressed that they're here bright and early and attentive. So that's the case. When I visited these estates and got to spend time with the extended family, I discovered that each of them is essentially running a mini factory. They work throughout the year. There's a lot of issue related to labor and capital and markets and numerous other such domains. And so I really say, I commend you for the kind of work that you all do and the fact that you adapt and cope with the challenges of running these enterprises on your estates. Anyway, before I continue on those lines, I must mention, to add to Mr. Bhatia's point about historic occasions, he mentioned 200 years of tea and 75 years of the rubber board. Some more historic occasions closer to home here. For the first time, we have a former president, Mr. I.V.R. Rebello, and his son, the current president, Mr. Jeffrey Rebello, in the same hall at the same time. And so that hats off to them. And for the first time, apparently, we have two graduates of St. Joseph's Boys High School gracing the podium as chief guest and president. So this, if some of you who were here last evening would have seen the excitement amongst our fellow Josephites. Anyway, now, one of the things that we taught our MBAs at IIM Bangalore or my classmates at Wharton was never to let a lack of detailed knowledge come in the way of being able to give insights on various things. We call them consultants, right? So there are a whole bunch of people who go out there and advise companies and organizations about how to change the way they do things. And while I'm speaking about it lightly, actually one of the advantages of reaching out to a consultant is that you are breaking out of your silo, you're talking to somebody who might be able to give a fresh perspective. So the first hat that I'd like to wear today in this address is that of the consultant. And when I think about what I see in your world, how do we enhance economic value? What can we do? Well, one of the first things that comes to mind is what you can do right where you are today, right? So basically, many of you are growing high-quality coffee, but as was pointed out, one other point I want to mention, that Jeffrey covered practically everything that I wanted to cover. And the program yesterday has also covered a lot of the points that I wanted to cover. But let me see if I can still be creative and make it still sound new and interesting. All right, so basically, if you're right where you are today, right? How do you add more value, get more income from whatever you do currently? So there, the concept of the brand is so important because the brand is really something that is in the minds of the consumers. The product is still the same. It may be coffee, it may be tea, but the brand associations that are in the minds of the consumers basically enhance the whole experience and allow them to justify spending more for the chance to experience that brand. And so that's one of the first things. And the brand can be done in so many different ways. For example, there's as people get wealthier and want to have more experiences in life, one of the things that they aspire to is something unique. And if you were to sell coffee saying this is from this estate, where the source of origin is highlighted, then maybe that becomes something that you would be able to command a slightly higher value. Now, other regions of the world, Colombia, for example, have done amazingly well in branding Colombian coffee. I don't know how much different it is, but when I was in the US for many years, we used to come across ads on TV with a gentleman with a mule. His name was Juan Valdez, and he was the icon representing Colombian coffee. And Colombian coffee, wherever it was sold, had this little branding on top of that, right? So one of the things, Mr. Bhatia, that government could possibly do to help add value is to market, or to help the coffee growers, the tea growers, and others to develop these brands that represent, the equivalent of Juan Valdez and Colombian coffee, and make drinking South Indian coffee, tea, all of these things somewhat aspirational. It is something that's eminently doable. It just requires a little bit of a push, and possibly the government can go out and do that. The other big development that can be really helpful to all of you is the fact that now you have these big online retail chains, right? So whether it's Big Basket or Reliance Retail or others, there is no limit to how many brands can be listed online on their platforms. So it's entirely possible for consumers who are going onto these platforms to order products to be able to discover a whole category called specialties or unique features or geographic indicators, whatever those might be. And it could be a way of reaching consumers in a manner that we've never done before. The other development in recent times is something called the Open Network for Digital Commerce, which is supposed to be a public digital infrastructure pioneered by Nandan Nilekani and others, which aims to provide competition to the Amazons and Flipkarts and these sorts of organizations. Anyone, including your local Kirana shop, is supposed to be able to put up their storefront on these platforms. And now everyone's into digital payments, etc. So the challenges that you might have faced in terms of reaching markets might be much fewer today. And many of you who are starting new brands, you could really launch on these platforms and find social media marketing methods to communicate who you are and what you bring to the table. So there's so many possibilities that exist in terms of doing things where you are right now. The other thing that I would like to mention is that often brands will sell when they are listed as award-winning. So if you have a whole series of competitions and award ceremonies and you identify the best brands, then that becomes an opportunity for those winners to brand themselves as award-winning, and that catches the attention of consumers and, again, will enable new markets to be tapped into. Now, the Starbucks CEO was here yesterday, and I met him at breakfast this morning, and he was talking about how Starbucks, which is a very expensive retail outlet, has actually penetrated into what we would call Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities as well, towns as well. Because the modern Indian experience is one where wealth is being generated across the country, certainly being generated in the big cities, and it's being generated in the smaller towns. You have high net worth individuals everywhere. But more than that, you have more spending capacity. As incomes have increased, as GDP growth has picked up in the 3 decades since liberalization kicked in, what you have is more money in people's pockets. And that more money in people's pockets is, the amount that they spend on what we call necessities is getting saturated. And they're spending more money on discretionary expenditure. And discretionary expenditure includes entertainment and travel and many features like this. So when you think about where the consumers are coming from, these are consumers who've got a little bit extra and who want to enjoy an affordable, enjoyable cup of coffee or tea or on one of these sorts of products. This revolution is actually, when I was growing up a few decades ago, India was supposed to be purely a tea-consuming country. But today, thanks to the pioneering efforts of Siddhartha, the late Siddhartha, and Coffee Day, and then now you have Starbucks, you have Third Wave Coffee, you have numerous other such chains, including some by estate owners in different parts of the country. Going to a coffee shop has become, very much like what they would do in Paris, right? And this, from the point of view of youngsters, it gives them a safe space to congregate. From the point of view of parents, at least they're not hanging around in a bar where they should be studying or spending an evening without, getting too distracted. So those sorts of things have really created a market for coffee. People who watch Friends, subliminally have been told that, drinking coffee in a coffee shop with friends is a nice thing to do, right? So these sorts of things are out there. There are changes in the marketplace, and they're making it possible for all of you to reach this emerging new consuming class, which has the capacity to spend and to find ways to push your products in the retail world. Now, what else can you do going into the future, right? So there, already Jeffrey pointed out, we talked about diversification. Now, diversification is not easy, but there are tremendous possibilities there. The same increase in incomes that you see happening across the country as the country grows wealthier and per capita incomes increase. See, per capita income is spread over, 1.4 billion people. But what we are talking about is the class, or 200-300 million people who have the capacity to spend. And that's probably sufficient. And those people, as you see urbanization, migration to the cities in this class, you also see a change in tastes. People are willing to eat more eggs. So the poultry industry flourishes. Drink more milk and eat more milk products. The dairy industry flourishes. Diversify their meat consumption. So all kinds of other products also have an opportunity. So this same thing would be applicable to the products, certainly of tea and coffee, that we're partly talking about on this platform. So this change, if you want to get to pay attention to this changing profile, changing taste of these emerging publics, these are also groups who are diversifying their taste for fruits and vegetables. And you have wonderful growing conditions for a wide range of fruits and vegetables. Take the avocado. Many of our relatives have avocado trees, the butterfruit trees in their estates, and every once in a while we get a nice, healthy, gift of avocados, and we enjoy experimenting with new recipes at home. But the point is, these have not been actively cultivated, while actually there's a whole market emerging because avocado is supposed to represent healthier fat than some other products. Let's talk about intercropping with oranges, with other, with other fruits and vegetables as well. Now, India is already one of the world's largest producers of fruits and vegetables. But we also have probably 30% or more post-harvest losses. We are terrible at transportation, logistics, packaging. There's a lot of wastage that happens after the crop. And certainly, speaking as a fellow farmer myself, I grow mangoes, a few mangoes and a few coconuts. And the only thing we do is the local consolidator comes and says, I'll buy your crop for a certain amount. And I say, great, that solves the problem for us. And absolutely no value addition beyond that. A cousin of mine, on the other hand, who has a larger mango crop, packages his mangoes as Mango Raja or something like that, and there are boxes that are sold and exported, and all sorts of possibilities exist. So similarly, if you were to go deeper into this issue of what the plantation sector could possibly produce in the form of fruits and vegetables, and you pay attention to the organizing of producers. So one of the real challenges, which was solved partly, for example, by the dairy sector, by Amul under Kurian, what we call Nandini, KMF, which was founded by my late uncle, M.V. Krishnappa. Basically, it provided an opportunity for even small growers to consolidate their production. Everyone becomes a member of a cooperative, they have voting rights, there's village level procurement, there's sort of processing at the district level, and then it's marketed and sold through a common brand. Now, you may not need to go to that scale, but if, say, avocados from Malnad or something like that are going to catch the attention of the market, well, it certainly is something that a few farmers can get together, a few estate owners can get together and form what we call a farmer-producer organization, which essentially performs similar tasks of adding value and helping create a market for these sorts of unique products. And if you scale this up, just like you have a Hopcoms in Bengaluru, you would probably be able to reach vegetables and fruits to consumers, to bulk consumers, restaurants and others. And before you know it, you have a whole other stream of income parallel to what you already have. Maybe floriculture is another domain where this would be possible. You're already, of course, very, very advanced in the context of tourism, to the extent that on weekends, apparently, there's an issue of carrying capacity, probably an overload. But even there's potential for adding ecotourism, maybe religious tourism aspects that go beyond just holidaying in verdant surroundings. There may be, depending on the land that's available, maybe some renewable energy possibility as well in terms of diversification of income streams. Now, the discussion on carbon sequestration, helping to play a role in this global carbon effort to reach net zero and to sequester carbon, there's tremendous possibilities. And India is already playing a role in this. I found that India has issued 278 million credits in the voluntary carbon market between 2010 and 2022, accounting for 17% of global supply. So this is something that right now is probably managed by agencies that probably charge you an arm and a leg. But there's nothing coming in the way of an UPASI working with government and finding ways of creating alternative entities that can compete with the existing certification agencies so that you're also able to play in this global market and get credit from the voluntary carbon market. For those of you who are wondering what I'm talking about, if a company in a factory for Germany is emitting a lot of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, instead of installing the equipment there in their factory, which might be very expensive, they might be able to balance out their emissions by planting trees in some other part of the world, where the trees would sequester that carbon, and it balances things out. Net, there is no addition to the greenhouse gas load in terms of the atmosphere. So this market has developed. It's a global market. For that, you will have to do two crucial things. One, everything that you do to claim credit has to be new. You can't necessarily claim credit for everything that exists already. And so new trees that you plant, you would be able to get credit for, and that should be also permanent, new and permanent. So that's really one of the key issues out there. Now, what are the other challenges? Well, I already talked to you about cooperatives and farmer-producer organizations. All of those take a lot of time and effort to put together because they involve what we call collective action. Collective action is hard. People have to spend time and effort, and the benefits go not just to those who put in the effort, but to everybody else who gets to benefit from that collective action. But you already have UPASI, you have the Karnataka Planters Association, you have, there are existing organizations that can play that role of catalyst to enable more diverse kinds of, diverse kinds of efforts in beyond traditional kinds of crops. So that's something that I think you already have an advantage, and you should really pursue how you can take this forward, and probably the Secretary General can lead an effort on a more continuous basis. Now, what else have I seen? Every time I talk to our relatives, there is concern about labor markets. Now, during the first lockdown, what did we see? We saw massive, massive levels of migrants moving back on the walking home, practically, right? Because of the lockdown. And when this happened, we realized the scale of urban migration. But all of you are substantially dependent also on rural migrants coming in from distant corners of the country to serve as temporary labor during various seasons. Now, this is a highly disorganized market. But if you were to think about how can you alleviate your pain on the labor front, India does have huge regions where people are desperately looking for work. You have regions like yours, where you're desperately looking for workers, right? So there is a demand-supply mismatch, and there, I think, between government and UPASI and other organizations, we probably need to find a way to start figuring out how to bridge this gap. Can we identify people who will actually go to the regions from where these migrant workers come and introduce some level of organization to this? Where today everyone has Aadhaar cards, people have you have identity, you have mobile phones, you have the ability to stay in touch, and you might be able, and by the way, many of the other factors that affected migrant workers will soon will stop being irritants. For example, there's this talk about one nation, one ration, right? That even if they're moving from their village to here, they'll still be able to get the subsidies through the public distribution system. So all of these will actually change the economics of taking care of labor and giving them at least your ability to address their sustenance needs will be alleviated by the fact that the government is already doing that, right? For all the fact that this is the first year of Amrit Kal, we're also providing free food to 83 crores of Indians out of 140. We're going to be a 5 trillion economy, etc. But that's the kind of imbalance and inequality that continues to persist in this country. So a lot of people would be willing to come. And the other dimension that government can play a role, and probably I could help in some convening capacity. I'm vice chairman of the State Institute for the Transformation of Karnataka, which is the new title for what used to be, the title used to be Deputy Chairman State Planning Board. Like Montek Singh Ahluwalia used to be in Delhi, the equivalent in Karnataka. And, basically an opportunity. I have the opportunity to work across ministries at the state level. And possibly if we work with the government, we might be able to do this on a more national scale as well. Figure out how to fill this gap. What can we do to enhance skilling and a more organized movement of migrant workers? You might be able to address and resolve this problem in a way that we haven't imagined before. Okay? I don't know what the practical challenges might be. I'm sure many of you are saying, what does this guy know about how to deal with labor or something like that? But my job here is to suggest possibilities, and for all you know, this is a gap that may be addressed very shortly, and you have facilities, you have labor lines, you have all these sorts of things that if you add education for their children in the local school, etc., you'll be able to make a huge difference to people who are otherwise desperate for economic opportunity. Now, What else can we talk about? If labor is only coming in seasonal waves, you might, if you are diversifying your crops, you might be able to offer them work throughout the year. You might be able to cultivate mushrooms for restaurants, who knows, or silk in more controlled conditions. All sorts of possibilities exist, which all involve labor. But if you have that labor during, and you can use them during non-seasonal periods, I'm sure that a lot of people would be willing to come and participate and settle in your estates and be there as your workforce. And when you invest in their upskilling, they will absolutely be even more happy with the opportunities that are created. Well, as I said, I also represent government. So what else can government do? Well, from what I understand, there are reforms required in the land laws, not in the manner that we saw in the center some time ago, but if we can convene and engage in what changes are required, certainly in Karnataka, I should be in a position to bring this to the attention. I'm vice chairman, the chairman is the chief minister, and so I should be in a position to try and initiate some changes along those lines. The other major issue, of course, is all of you taking advantage of the other schemes that exist under the government. Mr. Bhatia pointed out that those do exist, and you're all well trained and educated, but government can often be opaque, and we may not readily understand what all we could take advantage of, right? I understand there's a 3% interest subvention for the Agricultural Infrastructure Fund. How can that be tapped into, and for what purpose? All these sorts of issues arise. And of course, at the central level, where the Commerce Ministry is involved in negotiating free trade agreements, I think one pain point that must be addressed is, sort of the backdoor entry of products through countries which, from competitors through, say, Sri Lanka, in a way that evades the kind of trade agreements and the apparatus that we have in place. So that's something to watch out for. Finally, the big story that should actually alarm all of us is something that Jeffrey alluded to, and that is climate change. Now, climate change seems to be particularly real. This year, some parts of the world experienced intense fires. There were fires in Hawaii, there were fires in Europe, fires in Canada, okay? And these are not small fires. These are massive fires that killed a lot of people. At the same time, you had excess rain. We saw that excess rain in Himachal Pradesh. Whole towns being inundated and portions being washed away. About 5 years ago, I think I went to Madikeri to inspect landslides that had occurred again due to excess rain and possibly improperly planned construction as well. These all compound. And so if this sort of thing is happening, if we have seasons where you have excess rain, changes in precipitation patterns, these are going to pose an existential crisis sooner than later. So Jeffrey said that your community is very highly adaptable. Then let us anticipate, let us adapt, let us mitigate the challenges posed by climate change. So for example, in a deficit year like this one, when you're worried about sources of water drying up after a few months, right? What have you done about holding that water during times when there's deficit rain? In Southeast Karnataka, where I come from, basically we have created, irrigation tanks where water is stored and then water flows and actually overflows the Kodi and then goes to the next tank and then it's held there and then ultimately into a river basin, right? From, basically now in Bangalore, we have this something called the KC Valley project where we are bringing water in from the Kaveri to service Karnataka, to service the city, and we're treating that water and pumping it upstream to a different basin that, that then flows through these irrigation tank chains into Kolar and Chikballapur districts reviving groundwater and helping us become even stronger in terms of catering to the horticulture markets of that region. So we have learned to cope with deficit water supplies. Everywhere, government sets up Manrega projects where you build small check dams. So a little bit of water is stored and seeps into the earth and recharges the groundwater. To tell you how bad it is, the last time I sank a bore well, we struck water at 1,085 feet. Okay, that's a cause for tremendous celebration and animal sacrifice as well that goes along with this achievement of hitting water. It's become so bad. And this is sort of an issue that is going to affect many parts of the country. But I think all of you are used to rains coming in. But if you have to cope with deficit situations, you probably need to pay attention to rainwater harvesting in different ways. Similarly, on the occasions when there's excessive rain, you need to make sure that you have ways of letting that water go into the rivers and streams. So you have to be prepared for both. But one point that Jeffrey sort of missed out is when temperatures change, you have soil moisture levels changing, which affects the productivity of crops and what can be grown. You also have more fertile conditions for the spread of diseases. Right? More pests emerge, more diseases emerge, and so we can't be complacent that we'll be able to cope. We actually have to do tremendous research into more methods of addressing these sorts of things. If you go on the internet and look for Wayanad coffee climate change, there are stories about massive rises in rise in temperature and really increased pests and problems like this. So all of these are challenges that are going to come ahead of us, and we must find ways working together. The planters, the private sector, the public sector, all of us need to come together because the plantation sector is really one of our prides of India, and it's something that we cannot let suffer from lack of foresight and planning and concerted cooperative action. So this is something that I would urge you. Next time I meet you, I will ask you, what have you done in regard to climate change and steps? Because I'd spoken about this a few years ago at the KPA, and I have not necessarily known what has happened since then. But no harm in repeating it, and it's becoming more real and life-threatening in other existential ways. Finally, I'd like to, for the second time, conclude by telling you a story about a corner of South India, which is in the far northeast part of Andhra Pradesh, the Araku Valley, where an NGO called the Nandi Foundation has gone and worked with tribals and worked with regenerative farming and organic manure and things of that sort, and helped create products which are now being branded as Araku coffee. There's a store on 12th Main in Indranagar, and apparently there's a store in Paris. So basically, there's all sorts of possibilities that exist for transforming what is possible, even with populations which are not as sophisticated and educated as all of you. So given the kind of wonderful people that you are with global exposure, I am confident that there is nothing that is going to come in the way of all of you really transforming the landscape of the coffee, tea, rubber, and spices sectors and making UPASI an organization that pioneers a real economic revolution, an ecosystemic revolution for people in the plantation world and for all of you. So I wish you the very best, and thank you for inviting me to share a few insights with you today.